What's up, guys? This is my Civil War project. Okay, so I'm going to be starting off with the essential questions. So number one, what events were catalysts to the Civil War? What was the point of no return between the states? Why did compromise no longer work between the North and South? To what extent did the West represent a battleground over competing visions of America's future? What were the goals of the North and South in the Civil War? How did these goals change throughout the war? What advantages did each side have throughout the war? How would you account for the Northern victory? What did each side win and lose? And how did the Civil War both reaffirm and alter America's principles? Throughout the Civil War, the North and South had very many differences. Starting off, the North had a much larger and expansive railroad network. This allowed for faster transportation of troops and materials, so it gave them a large upper hand. They also had a lot more food, and the Confederate soldiers started to die of malnutrition because the South grew way more cotton instead of growing food. The North also had about 2.5 times as many people, and they had way more soldiers at the beginning and at the end, especially when they let all of the freed slaves fight with them. The South also had their fair share of advantages. Most of the war was actually fought on their turf, so they had a large home field advantage. This allowed for better defended ports. They also developed the steel and iron ships first, which were very powerful, and they utilized them on the naval front. They also had about 124 times as much cotton, although much of this was burned using General McLean's tactic for the Union soldiers. Now I'm going to be talking about the various abolitionist efforts and movements. Starting off, we have the Underground Railroad. In my opinion, this was the most influential abolitionist movement, mostly because it freed about 100,000 slaves. This was mostly started by Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. They used a series of tunnels and various other things to help slaves in the southern states escape to the north in Canada, where they could be free. Other abolitionist movements and leaders include Nat Turner, who led a revolt that viciously murdered 55 white men. This is an example of the violent abolitionist movements. The abolitionist newspaper titled The Liberator, written by William Lloyd Garrison, spread the message of abolitionism. The Free Soil movement advocated that states gained from the Mexican Cession should be free. Another is evangelical abolitionism, and this gives biblical justifications for abolition. Of course, there are many more movements. These are just the ones that I believe to be the most significant. Causes for the Civil War. In my opinion, the Compromise of 1850 was the most significant catalyst of the Civil War. Firstly, it admitted California to the Union as a free state. As you can imagine, this very much so upset the South because they wanted it to be a slave state. It also divided the remainder of the Mexican Cession into two territories, named Utah and New Mexico, different than the states. These are territories. And they allowed the settlers in these territories to decide the slavery issue, utilizing the new popular sovereignty. It also gave the land in dispute between Texas and New Mexico to the federal government. In response for this, the government assumed Texas's public debt of $10 million. They also banned the slave trade in District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., and it also adopted a new, rigorous fugitive slave law. Other causes include Bloody Kansas, where abolitionists and slavery supporters couldn't decide whether Kansas should be a slave state or a free state, so they started fighting. My opinion, this is kind of like a little mini pre-Civil War. Also, there is popular sovereignty. This got the Missouri Compromise appealed, and it lets states decide whether or not to vote individually if they wanted to allow slavery in their state. Also, there's John Brown. He was a radical abolitionist who justified abolition with God and thought it was his mission to abolish slavery. He personally caused a lot of controversy. Also, there is the infamous Dred Scott versus Sandford case. This is a dispute which ended up in the Supreme Court. Basically, it was over whether the fact that an enslaved man was free because, for a couple reasons, his master took him to Illinois, a free state. He also took him to Wisconsin, which is a free territory, as a result of the Northwestern Ordinance. And he also argued that the Supreme Court did have jurisdiction over this case, although lots of the public thought that he should have won, and from a modern perspective, he should have. He did not win, and this caused a lot of controversy and made a lot of people lose faith in our judicial system. When Abraham Lincoln was elected, this was the final straw for the South. Not a single electoral vote from the South went to Lincoln, and within the first month in which Lincoln took office, states in the South started to secede from the Union. These series of compromises failed to solve the conflict between the North and South because the two sections just became too sectionalized over one main topic: slavery. The South completely depended on slavery from an economic standpoint because they depended on exporting cotton, and cotton harvesting depended on slavery. This wasn't much of a problem for the North because they were far more industrialized and did not depend on slavery. Basically, the South depended on slavery so intensely, and the Union wanted to preserve the Union so intensely that they went to war with each other to protect their views. Goals of the Civil War. The North wanted to preserve the Union at all costs. Their general plan to complete this goal was to conquer the South and force them to join back into the Union. Another goal, although I feel this is more of a secondary goal, was to end slavery. The South took a more passive approach and tried to stay out of the war and wanted to be independent. They also hoped by avoiding major conflicts and keeping the Civil War relatively small scale, the North would lose support for the war and just let the South be. The South also wanted to secede from the Union and be their own independent country, where they could practice slavery in hopes of preserving their economy and growing it through the export of cotton to Britain. Obviously, both sides suffered enormous casualties. About 620,000 people died as a result of this war. But to be a little more in depth, the North got to preserve the Union and proved that their industrial ways were superior. Also, they got slavery abolished. They both lost a lot of money, but the South lost way more because A, the war was primarily fought on Southern territory, which decimated their precious farms and land, and B, the North made the South pay for the war.